Policy at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. And on behalf of the CIL and our partners, the Climate Markets and Investors Association, Durham University Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy, and the Global Ethical Finance Institute, I'd like to extend a very well welcome to all our panelists, two of whom are on the stage now, and to everybody who's here over your precious lunchtime at this side event, which is also generously supported by the London Stock Exchange Group. Now, according to the UNFCCC, the global additional investment and financial flows of up to USD $210 billion will be needed in 2030 to return global greenhouse gas emissions to the current levels. Private finance can play an important role in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, not only through mobilizing funding the transitions and for adaptation finance, but also by engaging with governments on the importance and the feasibility of ambitious and decisive climate action. Just as important is the alignment of the rules on trade and investment with the international legal frameworks on climate change in meeting the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, in the first segment of this event, we're privileged to have a suffet of speakers with us. So in the first part of this event, our esteemed panel, which will feature the Honorable Minister, Mr. Teo Felicie Tueti, the Minister of Finance, the Minister for Revenue and Customs, and the Minister for Statistics of Tonga. So he's on the way here. So I ask for your patience. The Minister is also the next chair of the Pacific Islands Forum Economic Finance Ministers meeting. And he supports the Honorable Prime Minister of Tonga in his role as a climate finance political champion for the Pacific. We are also extremely privileged by the presence of Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, who is also on the way here at the moment as we speak. He's a UN climate change high-level champion for COP27 and the UN Special Envoy on financing the 2030 agenda. We have also with us at the end of this panel table, Mr. Ralph Osa. He's the Chief Economist and the Director of the Economic Research Statistics Division of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And to my left, Petra Minerup, who is the Professor for International Law at Durham University Law School. Now, our speakers will explore how the global stocktake can be an ambition-enhancing mechanism by unlocking trade and investment that is aligned with the Paris Agreement international temperature goal. And this will then transition to a second discussion to be moderated by Mr. Jaakko Kooroshy, Global Head of Sustainable Investment Research at the London Stock Exchange Group, that will then discuss how investors are increasingly focused on engaging governments on their efforts to tackle climate change. Now, I wanted to kick off the discussion first with a question to Dr. Mahmoud, who is not here at the moment. So perhaps what I'll do is I can turn to Petra first, if I may. All right, we'll shake it up a little bit, switch out the order of the discussions, and I'll turn to you first. So maybe you can start off us by talking about the global stocktake. Dr. Mahmoud and Minister will be coming to share their sort of political perspectives on the global stocktake. But perhaps you can start us off with the legal governance issue. What is the perspective from the legal governance issue? What is the pathway by which the political sort of aspirations that we will hear from our two speakers, and what are the expectations? How can that be fulfilled by the GST process? Over to you, Petra.
Yeah, thank you very much, Danielle, for this very generous and kind introduction. Thank you to the audience for coming here. Indeed, fabulous to see you all here over lunchtime. Thank you also to those who are joining us online. And thank you for the co-organizers. It was a great pleasure, actually, to bring this site event together. And I'm sure Dr. Mahmoud will be joining us in due course now. So I think in this very distinguished audience, I don't have to go through the different elements of the global stocktake. As you know, we had this final summary report released at the beginning of September from the technical assessment phase, and we are now expecting an outcome at the conclusion of the first global stocktake at this conference. So from a legal perspective, I would like to make three main points what this outcome could mean. The first is that NDCs are, in my view, unilateral acts. So if they are submitted by parties with the intention of being bound, and I think this argument can be made when you look at the architecture of the Paris Agreement, that parties are discharging a legal obligation by submitting these NDCs, then they are also bound by these submissions, unless the wording is very unclear and allows us to conclude in the contrary. So if then the global stocktake comes to the conclusion that all these NDCs together are not strong enough or not good enough to be on track to allow us to reach the long-term goals of Article 2 Paris Agreement, not just the temperature target, but also Article 2, paragraph 1c, which is very important in this context of today, then there is a legal obligation of parties to enhance their ambition and to submit better NDCs. And this is not just a political obligation, but it would be very good if the decision at the end of this COP could state that in the clearest terms possible. Now, this view is also supported by a due diligence obligation that parties have. As you know, this has already been decided that parties must demonstrate how the outcome of the global stocktake has informed the preparation of their next NDCs. And so this is another way to strengthen the argument that as a matter of law, these NDCs have to be more ambitious after the global stocktake. In terms of the process of the global stocktake, I think a few observations will emerge, and this is also anticipated by the decision that designed the global stocktake. And as part of these observations, I think it is important to note that we need a closer collaboration of NGO and stakeholders within the global stocktake, and that also includes academia, and it includes scientific research, in addition to the IPCC-based research, because that is, of course, already something that parties will have accepted. So the IPCC report is approved by parties. And I think we need, in addition to IPCC science, also the direct input of science after a certain submission date to the next round of the IPCC assessment report 7. We need a direct influence of the science in the next round of the global stocktake, a closer collaboration. And I will just conclude with one final remark, and then we can hand over. And I know that there are time constraints here. I think what we should perhaps explore here more today is how we can ensure that Article 2, paragraph 1c is met, the finance flows being consistent with low greenhouse gas emission pathways. So
Thanks
I hand
very much,
over
Petra.
back to you. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I invite Dr. Mahmoud to join us? No, not at all. So I'm very pleased to have Dr. Mahmoud join us, and I know he has time constraints. So I'll turn back now, if I may, to you, Dr. Mahmoud. I'd like you to set us our context for our discussion. So Petra has started off by explaining, really looking at the legal governance, looking at what are the effects and expectations coming out from GST as a legal matter, and how that can be translated. But I'd like you to kick us off by maybe setting the context, the political context. You know, what are your thoughts on this global stocktake as a process going forward? What outcomes can we hope for, and what can we expect from this process?
Right. Thank you so much for the kind invitation and giving me the opportunity to address you all here. And apologies. I think one has to have a standard line of apologies for all events, not just me, all of you, because of the many competing events and overlapping activities. But I'm very happy to be part of this, especially with my affiliation with Durham University as now visiting professor at Durham. And until 5 days ago, I was a member of its international advisory board for the business school for many terms, and I think exhausted all extensions, but I'm happy to be of service to Durham, its students and research community in any capacity, even for a few minutes like today. Let me get the issue of the GST in context and perhaps give you an update on something that I was very much involved in, more than others during the last 2 years or so, on the Green Climate Fund that reached good results yesterday, but it gives you a lot of issues about governance. One aspect of the work here that we have a formal comprehensive, forward-looking, practical and pragmatic stock-taking exercise, the first of its kind since the Paris Agreement. It has implications. Yesterday, I moderated a session with heads of state and NGOs, civil society organizations, focusing on the means of implementation, on finance, on technology, incentives, and the rest of the means of implementation. Yesterday as well, my good friend Nigel Topping, who served my function for COP26, did the same function on mitigation, and Razan al-Mubarak did the same thing for adaptation. I think it was very much useful to have a kind of a comprehensive update of what the specialists already know, because many of you, if you are specialized on adaptation or mitigation, even the details related to the gaps and how to bridge them are not news to them. Basically, to bring that this is not the annual update like from the IPCC, which we rely on, and the GST itself is based on this science-based, evidence-based approach. It is not like the different scattered approaches to the matters, and actually in an hour or less from now, I'll be discussing a report on adaptation actions and finance. It's a comprehensive one, it's a formal one in terms of consensus building about what we should really be doing in the future. There are many ways to deal with that. One, I hope that won't be just a bureaucratic update, which is basically revisiting our NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. And it has been seen in many cases. I'm coming from an Arab African country. I can tell you of the case, focusing perhaps on adaptation. $11 billion of adaptation finance flew to Africa last year. What is required by NDCs is 55 billion. And what is expected to flow by the experts is 110 billion. Each number of these could be a subject to a PhD thesis, because you talk about the 11 billion, you can talk about governance, commitments, accountability, why adaptation is not incentivized, why some heads of state and heads of corporations are making promises and pledges that they do not commit themselves in doing. And what could be the best accountability framework for that? Is it enough just to provide these kind of peer reviews every year? And what happens if you fail? Here, at the international level, and you are experts of international law, there is little that you can do here if a country commits and don't deliver, and if this country has a change of government, you say, well, it's a previous government who are subject to democracy, so let's start again. And this is an issue of concern that is basically not just out of legitimacy of the whole thing, but it has its own risk that has never been discussed in the context of governance and accountability, because people, when talk about governance and accountability, they say there could be some sort of mishaps, irregularities, some issues that need to be fixed in the regulatory framework, but they didn't say, well, what if, and this is a real case example, if I listen carefully to one of the top officials from a European country, I will not name it, because the country is not here, and then because of that, I invested heavily in green hydrogen. And there was a promise to provide me with concessional finance as a minister or a member of government. And then changes happen, commissions leave, heads of governments leave, and then where is the accountability here? Am I making a deal with a person, or is it an institution? Where are the elements of continuity? And what can beyond MOUs? MOUs are never binding. They are nice in many cases just for photo-taking opportunities. But when it comes to their implication, they are leaving a lot to be desired. So this is just one thing that gets me into that 11 billion and incentives. And the 55 is telling me another story, that the NDCs are not reflecting reality. And they could be self-restraining, self-repressing themselves by not being ambitious enough. Why on the adaptation? Because they say, well, if I'm going to say that my country, home country, Egypt, for instance, puts an X amount of money, in this case, the government would know that no less than 97% of the finances should come from public money. Is it news to you? Everybody knows that adaptation finance by private sector is only 3% to 5%. So this is another area. There could be a reason Beyond what we know about the NDCs, some of them are better than others. Governments are not with the same sophistication or inclusiveness when they do that. The third part is the gap between the NDCs and the 110 billion, which is basically the critical minimum of requirements for African countries. And that was mentioned in the GST last year. That was mentioned by 6 heads of state from Africa when they say, well, we didn't contribute to the emissions. We are only 3 to 4%, the whole continent of Africa, which in itself an indication of poverty, low consumption, low production, because nobody should really assume that they are doing better in production with a cleaner technology. They are using the same available technology with its implications on emissions. So if your emissions are lower than your average, global average, this means that you are consuming less and producing less. This doesn't mean that you are doing better in the welfare and you are saving the planet at the same time. So injustice is basically one of the areas that have been a focus of the GST. How to fix it? We fix it by 3 things, and I'll stop. One is through, depends really on how to get it first. Technology, R&D, that would be really important in all areas of work when it comes to climate action. And today, we are better in producing electricity from renewables many times if we compare us only 10 years back. You can afford doing that because of R&D, production at scale, thanks to China, R&D, thanks to Europe and US, and wonderful engineers from Africa, from Arab countries, who adapt these technologies to local needs. But that needs this kind of ecosystem not to be broken. To your point about the politics and geopolitics, if any segment of this ecosystem is compromised, you cannot really have the Binban project of Egypt, which is one of the biggest in the world in producing electricity from solar, or the Ouazzazate of Morocco, or definitely one of the promising projects that was just opened last week here in the UAE. So this ecosystem needs to be complete for that first building pillar of making the change based on the outcomes of the GST. The second one is finance that I just spoke about. And here I need you to please consult 2 reports. One by Vera Songwe and Nextern on the gaps of finance for climate. It's telling us that we have a gap of $2.4 trillion per year, and this is excluding China. 1.4 trillion should come from domestic resources and 1 trillion from outside resources. Good luck with that. I mentioned the GCF. It was an uphill struggle with some countries just to mobilize the number of $12,475 million. Some countries were only contributing 4 or 5 million, with all due respect, of course, to their contribution. But it was not easy for their leaders to get this money out of the budget. So this is another area that you need to focus on when you talk about how to bridge the gaps of finance, public, private, domestic, and external. Does it remind you of another important report, an old report that goes back to 2015 of the Addis Agenda of the SDGs? It followed the same protocol. Yeah. And the final thing is in your domain. It's governance, incentives, regulatory frameworks, integrity. The current work now that is led last year by former Minister of Climate and Environment of Canada, McKenna, it produced 10 recommendations. Now we have 2 co-chairs from the US and China trying to operationalize and push these recommendations into the world of better understanding what they call recognition and accountability. Mm-hmm. And here, who will be then the chief accountability officer of the world? At the country level, governments are accountable to their parliament and to the civil society. At the company level, CEOs are accountable to their general assemblies. But for this world, people can just say, I promise, I will, I should, and then they can get away without any kind of mention to what they did. Here, I think the whole thing needs really to come, and nobody really improved this system of accountability, but there is an implicit assumption that each entity has its own accountability framework and has either political assembly or a shareholders assembly, or more important, the common domain with its civil society and sharing information to expose leaders of business and government, and actually as well some of the civil society organizations to what they should be doing. Great deal of work is ahead of us from now until 2030, and we don't need to think beyond that. There will be another discussion after 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmoud. I realize you do need to run, but I really appreciate that very extensive coverage. And I wanted to ask you, following on from there, there's a bit of focus on accountability, or rather lack thereof, in terms of the pledges and so on, a follow through. 2 questions before you leave, if you'll be so kind. 1, what do you think is the most critical, essential elements that you'd like to see included in the GST, the outcome of GST, in terms of governance language? What do you think should be the priority in order to rectify? Or is that even the right place to deal with that issue? Second is really to help us saturate to the second part of our discussion, which will involve the private sectors who are going to come on a panel later. What is the message that you want to share that governments need to hear from investors, or what investors need to hear from governments in terms of engagement in pulling through the process to making sure the finance flows? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if we identify those as 2 entities or 2 agents, government agents and private sector business agents. And I would say here, the GST, with the discussion that will be ending by this COP, had already delivered what it required toward the next GST. The reflection of that is going to be in 2 major stops. One, on finance and means of implementation, that will be the subject of next year's COP. So far, we don't have an identified place for it, but there is a mechanism hosted by UNFCCC, and we have a presidency that is continuing, which is the UE presidency, so to deliver on this part, on the finance as recommended as part of the means of implementation. I cannot emphasize more the importance of finance, and we need really to go beyond the 100 billion, which is actually the mandate of next year's COP, is to identify not just the new 100 billion, will it be 500 billion, will it be 1 trillion, will not identify just that it's a changing world. When they agreed on that in 2009, it was different from the world that we're living in with many emerging players. But actually, and here it's in the core of accountability. OECD declared 100%. Congratulations, everyone. We reached the 100 billion. This is on 2022. And then I said, well, this is a blessing in the disguise there, because many people who were basically doubting if their money is coming because they are part of those 20% or 30% that were never delivered during the last 3 years. But when you tell me, well, we delivered 100% finished, so I go and challenge delivery. I would go and challenge the standards and the methodology of accounting those beans of the 100 billion. And that will open not just the gaps and how they are going to be funded, but exactly, are we talking about gifts, grants, loans, commercial, concessional, or otherwise? Now the system that we have is basically giving everything that is being thrown from the global north to the global south as being accounted as part of bridging the gaps. This is one area that has the public and private accountability combined, and that needs really to be changed. Because I can tell you from the exercise of the Green Climate Fund, the current model with its generous assumption on financing transition, just, I hope, unjust as it happens today, if it is about just transition, we need completely different model of finance, or we're going to be talking forever about widening gaps and frustration of the impact of this, which is basically with sacrifices of lives and livelihoods. And the final part is basically the bigger accountability when it comes to governments. I would really, without complicating matters further, I'm not really wearing one of the standard pins of the COPs that I've been attending. It's all of the SDGs since they were created, the Sustainable Development Goals, because climate action is part of the SDGs, is number 13. The work on energy and mitigation is SDG 7. The work on water management and food is SDG 6 and SDG 2. And we are failing miserably in the SDGs as well, and we have good common sense prevailing last year when people proved that climate action is development action, so let's push into that direction. And this year, my good sister Razan al-Mubarak, the champion from the UE, brought biodiversity and nature. All of that are coming with their own pledges and implicit accountability framework. But what we need really, which was just been raised an hour ago, that we are in rooms that always have these kind of generous assumptions about the missing party that is going to be doing the work. You have a group of governments discussing among themselves how to bridge gaps of knowledge, finance, and they say, well, private sector will be doing that. Think tanks and research centers and universities are going to take care of the R&D and research. And then you say, well, goodbye, and then we'll meet next year. And those guys are not in the room sufficiently to negotiate what they do. You go and the private sector is no better. Private sector will say, well, we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, assuming that the government is going to pave the road in a better rule of law, governance, transparency, and disclosure. And who is the victim of all of that? Are basically the common people who had their trust in governments, elected or otherwise, and they have their trust in the assumption of that the business sector, with their mighty opportunities and resources available, they can really solve that because they have a share at the table. By saying that, I think we need a complete different philosophy based on what we have in order to fix not just climate action agenda, but what is not less of importance to it, which are basically dealing with the compromise that we had in the well-being of people, in their education, in their health, and poverty.
Thanks very much, Dr. Mahmoud. It's a clarion call and very holistic. And I'll be very interested to hear the views from the second panel after this, particularly your call to the investment and the private sector. What is their response? So thank you very much. And
thank you so
I really
much.
appreciate your time, and I know your time is very precious. Thank you
Thank
for joining
All
us
the best.
today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So Ralph, I haven't forgotten you. So
Thank you.
Dr. Mahmoud has talked a lot about governance, ecosystem, holistic. Now, you're an economist by training, and in fact, you're a chief economist for the WTO. Very interested. I know this was not something that I asked you to talk about, but I would be really keen on your response to what Dr. Mahmoud has shared. And before you go on to the questions that I have, really, given the governance aspect of it, and we wanted to talk about the interaction. So this question of intensifying geopolitical tensions, we're concerned about weaponization of trade, we have signs of fragmentation, we have signs of decoupling of trade along very geopolitical lines. What really is the scope for international trade agreements or trade governance more broadly to be part of the solution to climate change? And if you can position that within this larger ecosystem that Dr. Mahmoud spoke about, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for having the World Trade Organization at this event, but also more broadly at COP, because really what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make the case that international trade is part of the solution when it comes to climate change, when it comes to achieving the Paris goals. And this is, I think, often forgotten because I think most people, when they think of trade, they think of transportation. When they think of transportation, they think of transport emissions, and very quickly conclude that it must be part of the problem. And what I want to argue is not that this is wrong. Of course, transport emissions are important, but we also have to remember that transport emissions are a relatively small share of overall emissions, and there's large variation in production emissions across countries. So to the extent that you import something from a relatively green origin, on net, you actually reduce emissions. So if I say this a little bit more broadly, we all know that there's economic gains from trade, and economic gains from trade come from countries specializing in what they're relatively good at. What we argue is that there's also environmental gains from trade, and the environmental gains from trade come from countries specializing in what they're relatively green at. So for example, if you have a lot of sun, if you have a lot of wind, if you have a lot of potential to generate renewable energy, then what would make sense is that energy-intensive industries also locate in your country and then export not the energy directly, but the energy embedded in the energy-intensive goods to other countries. But the issue is that while the economic gains from trade materialize naturally as the result of market forces, the environmental gains from trade need some help, and this is where it connects to this discussion. We need to have the right incentives in place. We need to have the right policies in place. And just to give you one number, we did a simulation where we said, well, what if the economist's dream comes true and we have a global carbon price? I'm not arguing that this is likely to happen, but just to show you how powerful a trade can be, then of course emissions would fall. But what our research shows is that more than 1/3 of the emissions reduction brought about by a global carbon tax would be due to the environmental gains from trade. So in other words, trade is a very powerful force multiplier for climate policies. And if I can add one more consideration, because you were asking about geopolitical tensions, fragmentation, and so on. And this is indeed a big concern for us because, many of these environmental policies, in fact, most of environmental policies, understandably, are made by environmental policymakers, as they should. But what would be important from our perspective is that at least the trade perspective is also taken into account, because if you end up with a fragmented system of trade, of environmental policies that then generate trade tensions, that then either because you just have so many and the incompatibility in itself is difficult, or perhaps then there's concerns about carbon leakage and so on that lead to specific trade action that's being taken. Then you undermine. It's not only bad for trade itself, but you undermine the potential to leverage these environmental gains from trade. And I do think we need them, because if we don't manage to achieve this green transition in a way that's economically sensible, I just don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ralph, because I think your comments put to really come back gel very well with what Dr. Mahmoud said about the whole ecosystem has got to work together. They are not inconsistent, they don't work incoherently, but that's the economic view, there's a policy view. But can I turn to Petra from the legal governance? Yes. Or the ministers here? Oh, please, Minister, do join us. So I'm very glad the Minister, despite his very full schedule, is able to join us. So a warm welcome to you, Minister. So Dr. Mahmoud had to leave. He had given his comments on this whole issue of the global stocktake, what is needed, what is lacking, and a lot of his comments were focusing on accountability or lack thereof, particularly in the pledges and delivery of the pledges. He's also commented about the need for ecosystems to work together, which is what Ralph had just talked about from the economic aspects. But I wanted to turn to you, Minister, particularly for your view, and I think it's a very important constituency in the discussion. From the view of the Pacific Island Forum and member states, what are their views, what are their expectations of this GST process? And are you optimistic as to its potential to really function as an ambition-enhancing mechanism? And to unlock trade and investment so that the flows can also follow in terms of finance. What are your views on that, Minister?
Thank you for the opportunity, and very sorry for
not at all.
For coming late. I'm still trying to catch my breath.
We are all doing a very good exercise this week.
But as vulnerable developing countries, we faced existential threat of climate change. And Tonga and the Pacific Island Forum countries have high expectations for the global stocktake process, because we believe that the GST should be a rigorous and comprehensive assessment of the progress towards the Paris Agreement goals, and should identify areas that where countries need to do more to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change. The Pacific Island countries, the PIFs, also believe that the GST should be a participatory and inclusive process with a meaningful engagement with developing countries. We are concerned that the GST could be dominated by developed countries. So our voices and our priorities may be marginalized at this stage. So the PIF countries believe that the GST should lead to concrete action, meaning that we want the GST to identify specific actions, including the level of ambition, and the countries can take the reduced emissions and adapt to climate change. And they want to see countries commit to taking these actions. How does the GST function? Enhancing mechanism We suggest that the GST can function as the ambition mechanism, enhancing mechanism by identifying areas, as I mentioned, need to do more with these emissions, highlighting the best practices of countries that are making progress towards the Paris Agreement goals, encouraging countries to set more ambitious climate targets, and also providing a platform for countries to share information and best practices.
Thank you very much, Minister. If I may, quick follow-up on that, and really to link back to what we were just talking about. That sets the sort of the agenda, the aspirations from a particular level. And the other aspect of that we were talking about is really the coherence of the ecosystems working together. And that was a discussion that Ralph was just talking about. And I wanted to turn to you for your thoughts on this, Minister. On the interaction between the regimes of climate and the regimes of trade, the rules and investment. Do you think they work together synergistically and in alignment? Because I was going to ask Peter to talk about the legal governance, but I thought it would be very good to see your Minister's view from the policy angle. Do you see those working together synergistically? Do you see them working in tension? Which was also the point that Ralph made. They don't necessarily work in tension. They're actually co-benefits. But what are your thoughts on this, Minister?
Yeah, thank you again. I think the international legal frameworks and on climate change and also on trade and investment are complex and constantly developing at this stage. Sometimes these framework can work synergetically to support the sustainable development and also address climate change. And sometimes, however, there are areas that these frameworks also can conflict and create tensions. On area of synergy, I just can give an example, like the trade rules can promote the diffusion of low carbon technologies. For example, the WTO has an agreement on the environmental goods and services that reduce the tariffs on range of environmentally friendly products. But the investment rules can encourage investment in low carbon and also climate resilient infrastructure. Such, for example, the many bilateral investment treaties, BITs, including provisions that encourage investment in renewable energy and also other climate friendly technologies. On the area of tensions, trade rules can challenge environmental regulations. For example, several countries have cases with the WTO on rules for implementing environmental regulations and have been discriminated against foreign products, especially with their rules. And the investment rules can challenge climate change policies. For example, the companies use the investors' state dispute settlement, the ISDS, to provision in bids to challenge government policies, and can aim to reduce emissions. So, in my view, the relationships between the international legal frameworks and climate change and trade and investments, although they are complex, but there are areas that where the frameworks can be important that they can work together.
Excellent.
There are frameworks that important to consider the potential impacts of both trade and investment policies on climate change carefully and to ensure that the trade policies are consistent with the objective of the Paris Agreement. Yeah, and I think that's
Thank you, Minister, for that. And I'd like to end off on that point on trade and investment, and I'm mindful of time. So perhaps 2 minutes first to Peter and then to Ralph to end on a positive note. So Peter, address us on the legal governance issue. Do you think, where are the legal governments in terms of legal frameworks? Do they work well from your view? Where do they don't work well? Very quickly, 2 minutes on that, and then I can move over to Ralph to share a little bit from a positive perspective. What are kind of discussions is going on at WTO, particularly when you have the EU Green Deal on one hand, you have the US IRA, you have FTAs, you've got the OECD Climate sort of Investment Working Group, you've also got IPEF, you've got Green Economy Agreements. It's a whole panoply. how do they work together? So, but on a positive note, and then Petra, just briefly on the legal governance. Thank you. Yes, Petra first, and then Ralph, which I hope will end us on a positive note.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you so much, Minister, for your very interesting remarks. And to tie that back to what Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin also said, I think this accountability is very critical. And unless we manage somehow post-global stocktake now to institutionalize this in the process, I think it will be lost. And there's a huge potential to tie in the complexities of maybe the Biodiversity Convention as well, and also the trade rules. But I think a critical mechanism is actually inherent in the Paris Agreement itself, and that is Article 6. We already see many parties entering into these bilateral implementing agreements, especially on Article 6, paragraph 2. And so when they're now starting to trade with real verified and additional internationally mitigated traded mitigation outcomes, ITMOs, they must also be environmentally sound and legally sound. So I think this is really the aspect where we could tie in accountability, not only from other frameworks, but certainly also from research on environmental integrity, for example. What does it mean for certain areas? If we have certain temperature scenarios, and then ensuring that these investments are really safe, that they're also safe in terms of litigation, and that we don't even have to enter the discussion on Article 20 GATS, whether this is an exception or not, but really tying this into the agreement itself. And I think ideally we should have a working group on Article 6 agreements so that we have best practices emerging. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Right on the dot, 2 minutes. Over to you, Ralph.
Well, I very much like the idea of ending on a positive note, on an optimistic note. I'm always an optimist. So there's a lot of things going on at the WTO, more than I can summarize in 2 minutes. But let me maybe tell you of 2 initiatives we have at the WTO Secretariat that I think are very important. So one initiative is that our Director General launched a carbon pricing task force, which is going to consist of the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, UNCTAD, perhaps some other members also. And what we are trying to do is we're trying to come up with a coherent, I mean, we're still in the process of designing this task force, but it's going to be trying to attempt to speak with one voice and get some coherence into carbon pricing and related approaches, because as we discussed before, the proliferation of so many different carbon pricing regimes is really an important issue that can also lead to trade tensions. So that's one thing. The other thing, we launched yesterday a publication called Trade Policy Tools for Climate Action, also the WTO Secretariat, which gives you, 10 very concrete things trade policymakers could do to encourage the environmental gains from trade, but also the technology diffusion that the Minister was talking about, which I think is the second really important channel through which international trade can help. Because we all talk about investment and the importance of investment, but you need something to invest in. Yeah. And typically, the capital goods you need to invest in, they get imported from other countries that have these technologies. So that's really where the complementarity comes in.
Great, Ralph, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to move to the second panel next, which Jaakko will be moderating. I just want to give Minister one opportunity. What message would you want to send to the private investors, the private markets, on this issue that will help promote the financial flows?
Thank you. Just to have a quick I think it's important that have that working relationship between the government and also private sector, especially with policies involved. But I think I would like to just to say that the investors who embrace climate considerations in their investment decisions are not only mitigating risks, but also positioning themselves for long-term success. So I encourage private sector's player to one, actively integrate climate factors into their investment analysis and decision-making processes, to engage with governments and industry peers to develop and implement best practices for climate-aligned investments, and 3, advocate for supporting policies that facilitate the transition to a low-carbon economy.
That's great. Thank you very much, Minister. So over to you, Jaakko. But first, a warm applause for all our panelists.
behalf of the event to add a investor perspective to the discussion. As we're short on time, we're gonna keep this moving quite quickly. We have a brilliant panel today with us. I think Mahmoud was, Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin was referring to the COP disclaimer. I think we have to, I want to also go for that COP disclaimer in terms of the logistics. It has been challenging to keep the schedule and to all the speakers. But I think that was a fantastic discussion that we started off with. Really want to dig now deeper into how investors approach this. One of the things that we do at the London Stock Exchange Group, and my name is Jaakko Kooroshy, Global Head of Sustainable Investment Research at the London Stock Exchange Group, is that we look systematically at the commitments that countries make, mid-century commitments, NDCs, current policies, and we've been helped there also by institutions such as EASA and New Climate Institute, and try to assess, okay, what do these targets actually mean in terms of emissions profiles, and then what temperature outcomes do they align to? Not dissimilar from the global stocktake that was discussed on the first panel, with the crucial difference that it does name and shame individual countries as well. So because investors really want to understand, you know, where those commitments sit, and so. When we're looking at the outcome, we're not quite there where we need to be. If you're looking at the mid-century commitments, it's around 2.1 degrees alignment, so off the targets of the Paris Agreement. But we also have this ambition gap where the 2030 targets are less ambitious than what we see for the 2050 commitments. And you know, we see these ambition gaps being a full degree or even bigger for a number of countries like Australia, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and actually more than half a degree for another 7 G20 countries, including China and Canada. So lots of work to do. Now, this is the conference of the parties that we're here at. Now, when we're referring to the parties, those are, of course, the intergovernmental negotiators. But there's many others that are actually not parties to the process, including many investors here. And we have an excellent panel here, Faith Ward, who chairs the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change and is also the Chief Responsible Investment Officer of the Brunel Pensions Fund in the UK. We have Professor Nick Robbins, who in many ways was one of the pioneers of sustainable finance, and is now heading up a lot of the work on the just transition. And we also have Omar Sheikh, who is the CEO of the Global Ethical Finance Initiative. So we're going to dive straight into it, and maybe starting with you, Faith. What is the role of investors here at COP in your mind?
Thank you, Jaakko. And I think probably just also to pivot on the comments made by the Minister in terms of what he wants investors to do. I think I can reassure the Minister that I think we are engaged, you know, we are integrating climate into those investment decisions. That's very much the work of the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change. Its core to its mission is to equip investors to do that and to do that effectively. We also engage with the policymakers. I think what we're exploring today is what does that look like in reality? What is it we actually need as investors to make that relationship really work? What is it we're actually advocating for? What does good policy look like? So just to sort of make those connections with that last panel, because I thought there's some really great remarks which hopefully we will touch on a bit more. But as a sort of essentially the private finance, an actual investor, not just somebody sort of representing or, you know, sort of the groups, but we are the source of the capital. I allocate money to projects, to funds. So we are the actual, you know, this is where the book stops literally in terms of those investments. An investor, at the end of the day, it seems really it may sound slightly patronising to investors to talk about risk and return, but that is what investors are interested in. So when we look to kind of why are we here at COP, it's to try to convey to the policymakers what is it they can do that helps us within that context. And that requires that consistency in the policy, that certainty, that clarity of objective as to what they're after and looking to achieve, particularly in terms of the sectors that we sort of invest in, that continuity, and then to come back to this consistency. And we have seen some real big challenges in the last 24 months. We had some sort of brilliant momentum building into COP26, but since then we've obviously had sort of geopolitical sort of multiple crises bring about some challenges, and that has led to some rollbacks, which is then underpinned or sort of unravels some of that certainty, which then has caused kind of knock-on implications. And so one of the sort of classic examples, we often use the automotive industry and the certainty around that as being a classic example of what we wanted more of, only then for the EU and UK to then wobble on the one sector plan that we had all said, no, that is what we want more of. So that certainty, that continuity and that consistency is what we need our policymakers to create, that enabling policy environment for the investors to follow into. So a fast summary there.
Thank you, Faith. And Omar, over to you. The Global Ethical Finance Initiative does a lot of different things, including engaging with governments and working with governments. Can you tell us a little bit about the activities and how governments fit into that?
Sure. Thank you, Jaakko, and thank you to the team for bringing this important session together. So, look, I'm a private sector guy. That's where my world is. And we've been developing a series of strategic initiatives and programs over the last several years to help private sector finance move towards addressing some of these issues and these challenges that have been mentioned by the Minister and others. Now, our work for COP28 specifically, we're running the largest financial services campaign for COP28. It's a 12-month program that we started a year ago. Because those people who just want to do virtue signaling and greenwashing will all be here a few days ago. We'll all enjoy the weather right now and stay on maybe to enjoy Jumeirah Beach. But we started it a year back to really work with financial institutions to get them up to speed in the region so they can genuinely understand the challenges, the commercial opportunities, and then make the authentic commitments towards addressing that. And we're running that, Jaakko, in DIFC. Not here, not in the green zone, not in the blue zone, not even in Expo City, in DIFC, in the largest financial center in the whole Manassa region. And that's intentional because of the COP process itself is traditionally, as you know, for the environmental agencies, the agricultural industries, and the FS institutions are only now beginning to find their way and their feet around COP. But as Faith was saying, they're critical in setting the tone for COP. They're critical in setting the ambition levels from the governments and what can be achieved. And as we all know, financial services is the single most important sector in allocating energy across the economy into the different areas. That's the financial energy that comes with it. We did the same at Glasgow COP as well, because it was in our home city of Glasgow, so we were somewhat forced to look into this because we're one of the leading bodies for ethical, responsible, sustainable finance there. And that's where we learned all of these issues that actually, where does FS interact with COP? What are the barriers? What are the challenges? So as a result, we've been running a number of programs. We can talk about them later on. But that's what we do in short for COP.
Excellent. And turning over to you, Nick, I know you're running off to a ministerial at past, so great to still have you here with us. How do you, so we talked a little bit about kind of this setting the tone and the clarity of expectations. What do you think, what are investors really looking to governments for on the climate agenda?
Well, I think here, and very clearly coming out of the global stocktake, is the agenda is one of system transformation. That actually a sort of business as usual, investing as usual model is not going to get us to reducing the emissions we need to do to cut loss and damage or in terms respond to the harm that's already been caused by emissions. So I think, as Faith said, investors are here very clearly to signal what moves capital, very clearly to signal the policy reforms. And I think those policy reforms come in two shapes and sizes. One is the reforms in the energy system and the real economy, agricultural systems and so on. And we need to have the the policies which are going to encourage the phase out of fossil fuels and the ramping up of renewables. But also we need policy reforms in the financial system itself. We need policy reforms so that financial institutions themselves are accountable for their environmental impacts, and there's lots of work going on in terms of that, including work that the UK has been leading around transition plans for all major financial institutions to issue transition plans about how they're getting to net zero. So I think that's the theme here in terms of system transformation. And I think what is very encouraging is investors have really been an advocate for governments, and I think really the work you've been doing, Faith and IGC and others, to in a sense give governments courage that if they do take bold reform steps, that the capital will follow. And I think that's really important. One thing which Dr. Mahmoud mentioned, and is a big theme here, we have $500 trillion of assets in the global financial system. Most of that is in the global north. Most of the investment needs for climate action are in the global south. So to take my little country, the UK, our financial system has $35 trillion of assets. India has $5 trillion. Who has the biggest investments needs? India. So how do we get the system so that the assets, for example, that Faith runs on behalf of ordinary workers and people who want a decent pension, that they can routinely invest in safe assets in developing countries, in Tonga or whatever, get decent returns and contribute to the transition. And that's a puzzle we still haven't really cracked.
And if I just can stay with you on that theme a little bit, I think Faith said the job of investors is to think about risk and reward. Now, I think, Nick, you more than anybody has put the topic of just transition on the agenda for investors. How does that fit with that risk and reward thinking? And why do you think it's important that investors pay attention to the just transition?
Well, I would add another R to Faith. Risk, reward, and responsibilities. Investors do have responsibilities, legal responsibilities, and including respect of human rights and labor rights and so on. So I think for investors, the phrase is ESG, yeah, environmental, social, and governance factors, integrating those. And the just transition is essentially saying you've got a couple of really major environmental issues, E issues, climate and nature, but they are ultimately fundamentally linked to social. If you're going to deliver a rapid transition, deliver resilience, you've got to think about communities, workers, consumers, and so on. So it's really trying to overcome the silos, and we've been very encouraged, I think, by investors incorporating just transition into their engagement programs, working in terms of actually encouraging governments, and it's going to be, it's a big theme. So I think it's actually potentially recognizing that we're not going to get a transition unless we bring people with us. And again, investors can signal they can do the work themselves through their engagement, but also they can encourage governments to have the just transition plans, the skills plans, industrial policies, and so on. And so I think, yeah, investors have a role. And again, pension plans particularly represent workers. so it's actually, it's quite a natural thing to do. It's not as if it's a strange issue. It's actually a very natural thing that pension funds represent workers and so on. So I think there's a linkage there as well. It's not a different issue. Thank you.
Just to flag that, and as Nick knows, we've worked alongside in terms of sort of the financial sector's contribution to that just transition, but actually some of those tensions between the sort of the social and the environmental has actually been used as part of this rollback. Right. So we do have, I think, just to acknowledge the fact there is still this tension there, and those are being used, and the idea that sort of energy security and costs have to come at the price of our climate agenda is a false narrative, but one that's being played out in order to justify very short-term thinking. I know we're pushed as investors to be long-term, to think about kind of the whole system, to think, you know, how we can best sort of invest in that space. We need governments to also think that more systemically and think about the long term as well in terms of the decisions that they're making today and the impact that they will have. And we need the just transition to be genuinely a just transition for that long term. I don't think that they are in conflict, but it is being, I think, misused, I think, in the short term at the moment to cause challenge.
And Omar, this demand for clarity of signals, for long-term thinking, that comes from investors. Do you think that's landing with governments?
Right. Look, I've got the luxury of doing something now. I was just joining this panel last minute, so I didn't get the full briefing. But I'm going to speak very frankly, yeah, as a financial services person. It's very easy for us in the FS world to say we need government policy. Yeah? Very easy. Oh, until the government gives us all of this clarity and subsidizes our work and is the off-taker for everything we need, only then we are going to move. Yeah? Why? Because we've got this bad habit, risk-adjusted return, right? A lot of heads nodding in the room. Apologies for breaking the protocol here. Yeah? Risk-adjusted return, free money. Yes, I like it. Great, fantastic. You want me to do work for my money now? Oh, by the way, intermediation role, exactly as Nick's saying, exactly as Faith's saying. It's whose money is it in the first place? Was I told that my money that was deposited in my bank in the UK was being lent to subprime mortgages in the US? Do I have clarity, visibility, transparency, and choice on where my pension fund is invested? Is that process simple? Is it straightforward? Faith knows this very well. So we have problems in the financial services world as well. We have to accept short-termism. You just mentioned it. Yeah, chasing easy money. Yeah, why work hard for it? Innovation. Where are we innovative enough to really look at blended finance solutions? And I think that's what we're going to need with governments. It's not just pointing to governments saying set the policy agenda. Of course, financial markets like, consistency. By the way, we also like everything to be very binary. Yeah? In a diverse world, we want everything to be very binary. That's going to be great for us, isn't it? We want standardization. Well, read Permacrisis and you'll see we ain't going in that world going forward. So I think with due respect and humbleness and humility, the FS sector also needs to step up, think outside the box, be a bit more brave, be a bit more innovative, and be willing to have the ambition to really take on this challenge. If we sit back and say we'll just set the tone and we'll just do X whatever, then it's a relatively safe place for us to be. But we have the skill sets, we have the competence, we have the talent. It's amazing talent in this room, in the financial services sector. We have that ability to engineer solutions you guys won't even begin to imagine, right? By trading risk, by taking derivatives contracts. So we can genuinely do stuff, but the more simpler we keep it and the more inclusive we keep it, that really helps people. And the more of a choice that we give the custodians of the money, I think the better chance we have of cracking this nut. Because otherwise, left as it is, Mohieldin was saying it, it's trillions, right? Trillions, billions, I don't know how many zeros are in that. You guys are smarter than me, right? Every year, we're still falling short. Oh, the SDG, we set up an SDG financial products platform in 2018 with UN. And every year we've been falling more and more short. It was like 1.4 trillion then, now it's what, 2 trillion and so on. So stock takes are great, but what's going to change anything, right? And that would be my challenge to the FS sector as well. It's not FS and government, the obvious logic applies, yeah? But actually, in the FS world, I don't know if Faith, Nick, if you guys feel otherwise, I'm sorry if I've gone off script, but it's, I think there is a lot of introspection that we need to look at, particularly considering we were all bailed out by public money in the global financial crisis.
What a fantastic call to action, and I think this theme of brave innovators is a really I find that very striking. If I know two brave innovators in the financial industry, then it's the two individuals here on to my left. Nick, I know you have to run in a second, but there was one topic where we need brave innovation that I wanted to get to, and that's the topic of adaptation finance. So the sector has been very focused on the transition theme, but for those of you who don't know, July this year was the hottest July on planet Earth for 120,000 years. I almost fell off my chair when I heard that statistic. And so adaptation is becoming a challenge. It's becoming a challenge not only in developing countries, it's also becoming a challenge in advanced economies. And we do a lot of work looking at a physical risk for the G20. But Nick, it would be great to get get your thoughts on why has the industry focused less on adaptation and more on the transition piece, and do you see that changing?
I think it is changing. I suppose on the mitigation side, there's this artificial simplicity that we have a sort of simple metric of CO2, whereas adaptation, as we know, although is a global phenomena, expresses itself very, very locally. And so you need to think about those areas. And I think a lot of us maybe thought that those impacts were going to be further in the future. So what is now, these issues are now crystallizing. I was at a roundtable of chief financial officers this week, this week. And what was really interesting was actually how these two themes of sort of decarbonisation and resilience were actually just coming together. And particularly in the real estate sector, you've got a double imperative. One, you've got to make sure that your real estate portfolios get to zero carbon, but at the same time, you can't forget that these are going to be hit by heat stress, these are going to be hit by extreme events, flooding events, fires, and so on. And actually, are we really going to be just retrofitting and grilling our buildings without thinking about extreme events? We've got to do these two things at the same time. One of the challenges is that we're not necessarily very well adapted to actually non-climate driven extreme events generally. And then particularly when we're thinking about, again, the global pattern, again, most of the extreme events are happening in places where there is a complete gap in terms of insurance. So there's no shortage, particularly in developing countries and so on. So we have some real problems. I think that, again, this is going to be an area where looking at the risk, but new financial products, there's some new funds coming out, but I think you're going to want to potentially work with development banks, I would say, to think about the adaptation area beyond the insurance side.
I was just going to comment I do wonder, somebody's been sort of in this area for many decades now, whether we were victims a little bit initially of talking about sort of adaptation as almost defeatism. 10 odd years ago, with that, we were trying to go, we must decarbonise, and maybe that has sort of halted the importance of this debate, and it feels like it has been a bit of an afterthought. But I think what we've seen with the weather events that we've had over, certainly as you say, the last 2 or 3 years, is that people are recognising, even at 1.5, even if we hit the 1.5 goal, we have still baked in an awful lot of physical climate risk, and there is a need for adaptation. As I say, even with that, looking at it from that perspective, what I find interesting is actually, in terms of sort of societal people, normal people, as interest, is the amount of questions and challenges I actually get from beneficiaries on what are we doing about physical climate risk. It feels as if actually some of my sort of actual savers, my beneficiaries, the actual person for whom we're investing, has a bit more of a grasp of the issue sometimes than many of the people we have to kind of engage with on this topic. I'm sort of hopefully making up for lost time. I'm co-chairing the transition plan task force work stream on adaptation to really trying to elevate and to champion its importance within the transition planning within corporates, because we need to reward corporates for taking this action. It is a win-win. I think there was a concern that just how do you actually monetize? It always seems that private finance, it comes down to the money, but sometimes, and I think some of the sort of more recent research that we've had from like the National Institute for Building has demonstrated for every dollar invested could save anywhere to $5 to $11 in avoided losses. Well, as an investor, I want you to avoid those losses. It can actually improve cash flows, it can improve valuations. So actually the business case is actually there. It is very strong. We just need to make it quite loudly. And then this is the investor community. The call to action is to reward companies who are taking those actions. You need to make it really clear to them that this is exactly what you want as a shareholder of those or an investor in those assets, that this is important to you, to elevate that it cannot and must not be an afterthought.
Excellent. We're going to continue on this topic, but I think Nick, the ministers are waiting for you. 5 minutes. You had 5 minutes, great. Yeah. So I wanted to pivot to the question of tools, really, right? And how do we what is lacking for investors in terms of better tooling to price these risks in, to send clearer signals, to manage these risks better? And maybe, Nick, starting with you, if you still got you for 5 minutes on that.
Yeah, it's a big area. I mean, I think one of the things which we were going to come on to, and I think is this relationship really between investors and governments. And one of the areas which I'm sure Faith will want to touch on is the role investors have. Because investors don't just invest in companies or projects, they also invest in sovereign bonds, the debt of governments and the debt of municipalities. And that is an area where if you're going to have a net zero resilient portfolio, you obviously want your sovereign bonds to be doing that. There is an initiative which the LSE is part of called ASCOR, the Assessing Sovereign Climate Opportunities and Risks, which has got a very good framework for that, a very consensus-based framework. A couple of things I just wanted to sort of add on that. We've been doing some work actually with another group of investors who you wouldn't think of as investors, central banks. Because central banks actually invest a lot in sovereign bonds, and they've been thinking about what they do when they're actually engaged in monetary policy and their own pensions, their own operations. How are they going to make their operations aligned in terms of sovereign bonds? Because as we know, they hold a lot of sovereign bonds. So I think that model is sort of data-driven, robust, but trying to be consensus-based. I think has been a very good example, I would say, in terms of tools, I think.
Faith, do you want to come in there? I know you guys are thinking about this topic a lot as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're also involved, the IGCC is also involved in the ASCOR project, recognising, and you'll see when we're looking at increasing the focus on that within our net zero investor framework and the target setting kind of around there. So I think there's two things I want investors to do. One is to put public policy advocacy much higher up their agenda, and recognising how systemically important it is that we get this stuff right, and to have those engagement calls. So first thing is to put it at the top of the strategy. The second then is to equip them with the mechanism to hold those countries to account, not only in their policy engagements, but actually, and then as Nick says, in terms of that sovereign bond and those allocations. It is very complicated, so just to not to be too breezy about it, because how do you make sure you're assessing a country without some unintended consequences of removing the capital from the very countries that are the most vulnerable? That is quite a difficult thing for an investor to square when you're looking at those. So it is complex, but I think the understanding of that nuance is there, and we're trying to equip investors to kind of get better at this, and that's. But it's still probably work in progress. It's probably a fair comment. This is probably one of the newer areas of sort of the tooling up of investors with respect to sovereign debt. But how is it from your side?
Okay, so we launched at Glasgow COP the world's first SDG fixed income sovereign fund with Aegon. It's a £100 million fund, pioneering, looking at all the SDGs and looking at sovereign bonds and their performance against it. It's part of our SDG financial products platform work that we did. So yes, I know some of the technical details in terms of making those judgments and how performance is against that, and then indeed even the limitation of engagement as what can you do with governments if you're a fixed income asset manager. Now, I think, though, taking it back another step is the tools that you're talking about. Do we have the necessary tools? Look, financial services moves by two things and two things only: compliance and regulation, and fundamental demand in the market. So when compliance and regulation tells us, SFDR, Article 8, 9, whatever that is, or now SDR that we just got out in the UK just the other week, that dictates to us where we can allocate our capital. Apologies if this is a bit too simplistic for people who are familiar with this in the room. So that's a massive thing that directs us. So that's the ultimate tool, Jaakko, right? If regulation says you move in this direction, then you move in that direction. So we did a lot of work in Nigeria for 4 years, where they gave subsidized, capital requirements for banks to lend to the agri sector, right? So there was incentivized behavior there. Similarly, State Bank of Pakistan have done, and others. So there's the regulation piece, and then there's the fundamental demand piece. And I think that fundamental demand piece, with conscious consumerism, with the increased information and knowledge and fintech solutions, you're seeing people wanting to move in different directions. I saw firsthand from the late 90s, when I first asked the question about ethical finance in the City of London, I was laughed at and told, oh, Omar, that's for tree huggers, hippies, and the faithy guys. Go speak to the Church of England, and by the way, it's a haircut on performance, so don't waste my time, kind of thing. And this was, by the way, and I was just a young, curious chap going through my CA exams at the time, you know, trying to figure out what's going on in the world, and found it very interesting. But I saw firsthand, at a similar time, the journey of Islamic finance in the UK and in Malaysia and in this region here. And I saw how the same cynicism about an ethical form of financing, faith-based financing, Islamic finance is just one subset, $4 trillion market. Indeed, LSEG, one of the primary listing jurisdictions for a lot of the green sukuk, and signed a big program this morning with ISDB and ICMA on that. I found firsthand all of these same comments: doesn't make money, oh, additional regulation, oh, there's not enough demand. And by the way, over 20 years, you see which one of those arguments were actually false, which just disappeared, and how the market evolved. Gives me a sense of encouragement that actually there is a lot more if you have the ambition and the leaders in financial services and financial institutions are brave enough to go through this. We will always have issues, and it's sectoral, so sustainable ag, energy. You know, you will have all of these sectoral issues, like can you get planning permission for offshore seabed wind farms, right? That's not the FS sector. That's the problem with the local planning. And that's where governments need to, of course, come in and give not just that clarity, but I think governments need to have dedicated task forces to expedite action in these select sectors. And it's not everything. It's actually just very few select sectors that if you can intervene, rapid response, the financial institutions will move very well with that.
Nick, you need to go.
I just want to build on what Jaakko said. When the first ethical fund came out in the UK, it was nicknamed the Brazil Fund, because people thought it was nuts. So that's the scorn within the mainstream financial system. And I think what is interesting now is you need these innovators who are willing to go ahead of the market and actually take and try things out, and then through regulation you then normalize that good practice through transition plans and so on. But you do need to encourage those people who are willing to stick their neck out, because otherwise we're not going to get the change.
And I think this is why this is so important when you said about bringing everybody together, because I think there's probably more scars on the three of us in the panel in terms of some of those debates. And we are willing to be courageous, but we need our policymakers to kind of step with us on that journey. And I think it's that, and that's trying to work together and getting us around a table, having those conversations, and for both parties to be better listeners. I'd say that, you know, repeatedly sometimes you sort of hit some of those roadblocks where perhaps the policymakers are not listening to the expertise within the finance sector, going, there are unintended consequences of your actions. This is how this is how it needs to be kind of nuanced or work, and be a bit more flexible. Similarly, as you say, the finance sector also needs to not wait for some of those policy signals, but actually to take that sort of that positive step forward in terms of those investments in sort of climate solutions and the transition finance that we need to make. So it is, but it very much comes to the essence of what this panel is about, which is trying to bring everybody around the table simultaneously to have sort of much more thoughtful conversations.
And Omar, I think when we were chatting just before the panel, I think one thing that you mentioned to me is that sometimes investors and governments perhaps don't understand each other very well. And do you want to talk a little bit about more what you meant about that? And
Language. Big problem. Ours is a small Edinburgh headquartered NGO where private sector individuals who lead get Jeffy. And surprisingly, and I've often been shocked at this, and I'll give you an example that just happened the other week. We've managed to get the largest bank in Pakistan, 5th most populous country in the world, the first and the largest bank to sign up to the UN Principles of Responsible Banking, UNPRB. The UN, UNEP-FI, UNFCCC, with all of its machinery, all of its people on the ground, everything, were still incapable of getting a single bank in that region to sign up to PRB. Why is that? And I'm not saying this to blow our trumpet. I'm shocked. I'm actually shocked myself. That what is it that's going wrong here? And one of the biggest things I've noticed is being nimble, being agile, but most importantly, being able to speak the language of financial institutions. We've just said finance. Finance, again, is not homogeneous. We split it by asset classes. My primary expertise is in the private equity space, right? We haven't even touched on that today in this panel, yeah? So finance is very, very different, although we're talking in a very general terms here, yeah? What banks can do is very, very different to what asset managers can do. What sovereign wealth funds, in this region, sovereign wealth fund, Masdar particularly, has shown leadership. What they can do is very different. So that language, lack of understanding of the language, the way the finance sector moves, I think is a hindrance in this communication. And also in the finance world, when you speak to them, well, that's policy. Well, that's SDGs. It's nothing to do with private sector. I can't put that into my investment philosophy or into my investment analysis process. So there is, and I'm sure Nick's seen it, and Faith, you must have seen it over decades, similarly, this language gap, this barrier where it takes, that needs to be bridged. Otherwise, you will not have a successful engagement.
And not just policymakers, but they're particularly one of the key areas, I think, is development banks. I know that's going to be a core topic of COP28. And that has been that sort of language, or particularly when they're talking about sort of investors or private, the sort of pension fund type investments, which is very much more my sort of area, going, I'm not a development, I'm not a bank. So the way that we think about investment cases is very different from a bank. And as you say, this idea that finances are some sort of homogeneous sort of lump, but actually, as you say, we do need to kind of improve the sophistication of that communication. The other point which I think is also relevant is the interoperability. So we are global investors. So anybody in, all of our members are global investors. So a policymaker looking at it from their own kind of policy silo is not terribly helpful to us. We need interoperability, we need harmonisation. And the more that governments actually work together and actually recognise that sort of dynamic as well as that language, but actually talking to each other and working collaboratively also helps us as a finance community in terms of those investment flows. Because we haven't got the resources to go through a separate process for each individual country or sector. We just need to be able to, if you want the money, if you want it scaled fast, harmonisation and standardisation gets you a long way.
It's been a fantastic panel. We're actually out of time. Omar warned you right at the beginning. We're going off script here. Yeah, what a fantastic journey it has been. Sometimes the best journeys are off the map. I just wanted to give you guys kind of 20 seconds to kind of bring your key message to COP, to governments on sustainable finance. Nick.
So very clearly we need a transformation of the financial system. We can't have investing as usual. And we're also going to need new financial institutions. And the one institution I think is doing a really interesting job at the moment is India's National Infrastructure Investment Fund, which is owned by the Indian government but has separate funds which are attracting pension funds from OECD countries and investing on commercial terms. So actually it is speaking the same language. You've got a government institution but operate on commercial terms, giving that confidence of being rooted in the country, understanding issues, and attracting capital which needs to pay ordinary people decent pensions. So I think we need new institutions as well as new tools, and the India's National Infrastructure Investment Fund is great, but many more of that, I'd say.
Excellent.
And
Omar?
It's a tough one. I think, see you, Nick. I think if you just sit back and realize how we got into this mess in the first place, yeah, half your answers are going to lie in there. The negative externalities and consequences of the way our economy, capitalism, our financial service institutions operate will give you half the answer.
No?
I don't think they can be left to simply doing risk return, because that's their principal mindset, right?
Hello? Hello.
So,
hi, sorry, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but
our
unfortunately this meeting is over. We need to make room for the next meeting. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, there we go. Well, it was a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the brilliant panelists. And enjoy COP.